Welcome to the channel. Today's story takes us to 1858, following Daniel Cross, a man forced to watch his wife and children be sold. A man whose actions afterward would leave a lasting mark on history. This is a painful and intense account of loss, endurance, and consequences that still echo through time. Take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered, not buried. Let's begin. In the spring of 1891, just outside Toronto, Canada, in a small town, an old black man took his last breath. His name was Daniel Cross. He was 71 years old. His hands, once strong enough to bend iron, now rested peacefully on his chest. Around his bed stood his wife Ruth, his 3 children, and 11 grandchildren. His final words, whispered to his wife of 50 years, were simple. "I found them all, Ruth, just like I promised." Those 7 words carried a weight only Ruth understood. Because 53 years earlier, in a place called Natchez, Mississippi, Daniel Cross had made a promise that would transform him from the most obedient slave in the county into the most feared man the American South had ever seen. This is not a story about slavery. This is a story about what happens when you take everything from a man who has nothing left to lose. This is the story of Daniel Cross, and what he did in the year 1858 still haunts the history books to this day. Let me take you back to a time when human beings were bought and sold like cattle. Back to a place where the color of your skin determined whether you lived as a man or died as property. Back to Natchez, Mississippi, in the heart of what they called the Cotton Kingdom. Natchez sat high on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. In 1858, it was one of the wealthiest cities in the entire United States. More millionaires lived within its borders than in New York City, and every single dollar of that wealth was built on the backs of enslaved people. The soil around Natchez was rich and dark, perfect for growing cotton, and cotton in those days was king. It fueled the economy of the entire nation. Northern factories spun it into cloth. Southern planters grew rich selling it. And the enslaved people who planted it, picked it, and processed it received nothing but suffering in return. About 12 miles outside the city stood a plantation called Thornwood. It covered over 4,000 acres of prime cotton land. At its center sat a white, columned mansion that could be seen for miles. The house had 14 rooms, each decorated with furniture imported from France and England. Crystal chandeliers hung from every ceiling. Silver candlesticks lined every mantel. From the outside, Thornwood looked like a palace. But for the 847 enslaved people who lived and worked there, it was a prison. A beautiful, elegant prison where families were torn apart, where bodies were broken, and where hope went to die. The man who owned Thornwood was Colonel Edmund Whitmore. He was 62 years old in 1858, a third-generation plantation owner whose grandfather had carved the estate out of raw wilderness back in 1795. Colonel Whitmore stood 6 feet tall with silver hair and a thick mustache that he waxed every morning. He wore white linen suits even in the brutal Mississippi summer. He attended church every Sunday, donated generously to local charities, and was considered one of the most respected men in the county. He was also, by any reasonable measure, a monster. Colonel Whitmore had a habit, a very expensive habit. He gambled. Cards, horses, dice, it did not matter. If there was a way to bet money, Edmund Whitmore would find it, and he almost always lost. Over the years, his gambling had drained the family fortune. Debts piled up. Creditors circled like vultures. But Whitmore had a solution to every financial problem. He simply sold his slaves. Families that had lived on Thornwood for generations were ripped apart whenever the colonel needed to cover a debt. Mothers sold away from children. husbands separated from wives, brothers and sisters sent to different corners of the South, never to see each other again. To Connell Whitmore, these were not human tragedies. They were simple business transactions. Now, among the hundreds of enslaved people on Thornwood, there was one man who stood out. His name was Daniel Cross. He was 38 years old in 1858, and he worked as the plantation blacksmith. Daniel was not particularly tall, maybe 5'10", but his shoulders were broad, and his arms were thick with muscle built over decades at the forge. His hands were remarkable. Scarred and calloused, yes, but capable of incredible precision. He could shape iron the way a sculptor shapes clay. He could take a piece of raw metal and transform it into anything: tools, horseshoes, hinges, locks, weapons. Whatever was needed, Daniel could make it. His skill made him valuable, very valuable. Plantation owners from across the county would send their broken equipment to Thornwood just so Daniel could fix it. They paid Connell Whitmore good money for the privilege. A skilled blacksmith was worth more than a dozen field hands, and Whitmore knew it. That is why Daniel received certain privileges that other slaves did not. He had his own cabin near the forge. He was allowed to keep a small garden. He was never whipped, because damaged hands meant damaged profits. In the twisted economy of slavery, Daniel Cross was an asset to be protected. But none of these privileges mattered to Daniel. None of them. Because everything he cared about, everything that made his life worth living, was not his skill or his cabin or his garden. It was his family. Daniel had been born on Thornwood in 1820. He never knew his mother. She was sold when he was 3 years old, sent to a plantation in Louisiana. He never knew her name, never saw her face, never heard her voice. She existed only as an absence, a hole in his heart that never quite healed. His father lasted a bit longer. Daniel remembered him as a tall, quiet man who worked in the cotton fields from sunrise to sunset. When Daniel was 7, his father tried to escape. They caught him 2 days later, about 15 miles north of the plantation. The overseer made an example of him. He was whipped until his back was nothing but raw meat, then left tied to a post in the summer sun. He died 3 days later from infection. Daniel watched the whole thing. He was 7 years old. After that, Daniel learned the most important lesson a slave could learn: keep your head down. Work hard. Never complain. Never resist. Never give them a reason to notice you. Survival meant invisibility. So Daniel became invisible. He worked at the forge. He perfected his craft. He spoke only when spoken to. He never looked a white man in the eye. He never raised his voice. For 30 years, Daniel Cross was the perfect slave, the model of obedience, and he hated every single second of it. Then, when Daniel was 22 years old, something changed. A wagon arrived at Thornwood carrying a group of newly purchased slaves from a plantation in South Carolina. Among them was a young woman named Ruth. She was 18 years old, slender and tall, with eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She had been sold after her previous owner died, and his estate was liquidated. She was assigned to work in the big house as a cook. Daniel first saw her carrying water from the well. She moved with a quiet dignity that he had never seen before. Most slaves walked with their shoulders hunched, their eyes on the ground, beaten down by years of degradation. But Ruth walked straight. Not defiantly, not foolishly, but with a kind of inner strength that nothing could touch. He found excuses to pass by the kitchen. He lingered near the well when she came to fetch water. For weeks they barely spoke. Just glances, small nods, the beginning of something neither dared to name. One night, Daniel found her sitting alone behind the smokehouse, crying silently. He sat down beside her without saying a word. They stayed like that for an hour, two strangers sharing the weight of an unbearable existence. Finally, She spoke. "They sold my sister today. She was 12 years old. I raised her after our mother died, and now she's gone." Daniel did not offer empty comfort. He did not say it would be all right, because they both knew it would not. Instead, he told her about his mother, about his father, about the emptiness that never went away. For the first time in his adult life, Daniel Cross opened his heart to another human being. They were married 6 months later. It was not a legal marriage, of course. Slaves could not legally marry. The law did not recognize their humanity, let alone their love. But they had a ceremony anyway, conducted by an old preacher named Samuel, who lived in the slave quarters. They jumped over a broom, the traditional slave wedding ritual. They spoke vows to each other. "Until death or distance do us part." That was how slave marriages went. Not "until death do us part," but "until death or distance." Because everyone knew that the master could separate them at any moment. But Colonel Whitmore, for once, was not cruel about it. Daniel was too valuable to upset. A happy blacksmith worked better than a miserable one. So the marriage was permitted. Daniel and Ruth were given a small cabin together. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Cross knew something like happiness. Then came the children. Samuel was born in 1843, named after the preacher who married them. He grew up strong and serious, with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's watchful eyes. From the age of 10, he worked in the cotton fields, because even a blacksmith's son was not exempt from the harvest. But every evening he would come to the forge and watch his father work, learning the secrets of fire and metal. Eliza came next in 1846. She was a gentle child, quick to smile and slow to anger. She helped her mother in the big house kitchen, learning to cook the elaborate meals that the Whitmore family demanded. She had a gift for it. Her biscuits were so light they practically floated. Her pies won praise even from the mistress, who rarely praised anything. And then there was Benjamin. Little Benjamin, born in 1851, he came into the world on the same night that the mistress gave birth to her youngest son. 2 babies born hours apart. One in the big house, and one in the slave quarters. One destined to inherit thousands of acres and hundreds of human beings. The other destined to be property himself. Benjamin was the joy of Daniel's life. Where Samuel was serious and Eliza was gentle, Benjamin was pure sunshine. He laughed constantly. He asked 1,000 questions a day. He followed his father everywhere, fascinated by the sparks that flew from the forge, the hiss of hot metal plunged into water, the transformation of raw iron into useful tools. Daniel would hold him on his knee and tell him stories. Not stories of Africa, because Daniel had no such stories to tell. His family had been in America for generations, their homeland forgotten, their history erased. But he told stories of hope, of a place up north where black people were free, of a future that might be different from the past. For 16 years, Daniel built his life around his family. Every swing of his hammer, every hour at the forge, every moment of obedience and submission. It was all for them. He would protect them. He would keep them together. He would make sure that what happened to his mother and father would never happen to his wife and children. He believed that if he was good enough, obedient enough, valuable enough, they would be safe. He was wrong. The morning of March 14, 1858, started like any other. Daniel woke before dawn, kissed Ruth on the forehead, and walked to the forge. The fire was already burning when he arrived, fed by the young apprentice who slept in the corner. Daniel began his work, shaping a new axle for one of the plantation wagons. The rhythmic clang of hammer on metal filled the air. The sun rose. The day began. Around mid-morning, a wagon arrived at the main house. Daniel noticed it from a distance, but thought nothing of it. Wagons came and went all the time. It was probably a delivery. Fabric for the mistress, tools for the fields. Nothing unusual. But then he heard the screaming. It was Ruth's voice. He knew it instantly. Knew it in his bones. Knew it the way a man knows his own heartbeat. And it was screaming in a way he had never heard before. Not anger, not pain, terror. Pure, absolute terror. Daniel dropped his hammer and ran. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, his heavy boots pounding the dirt path, his lungs burning. The sound grew louder as he approached the main yard. More voices now. Children crying, men shouting. When he reached the yard, he saw a scene that would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. Ruth was on her knees in the dirt. A white man Daniel did not recognize was holding her by the hair, dragging her toward the wagon. She was clawing at the ground, screaming, fighting with everything she had. But she was small, and he was strong, and it did not matter. It never mattered. Samuel was already in the wagon, his hands bound with rope. Blood ran down his face from a gash above his eye. He had fought. Of course he had fought. He was his father's son, but 3 men had beaten him into submission. And now he sat slumped against the wooden slats, barely conscious. Eliza was standing frozen near the kitchen door, her apron still tied around her waist. 2 men were walking toward her. She was not screaming. She was not crying. She was simply staring, her face blank with shock, her mind unable to process what was happening. And Benjamin, little Benjamin. He was in the arms of another white man, squirming and crying, reaching out toward the chaos, calling for his mother, calling for his father. Daniel did not think. He did not plan. He simply charged. He made it 3 steps before the first overseer tackled him. Then another, then another. It took 5 men to bring Daniel cross to the ground. 5 men to hold him down while he thrashed and roared like a wounded animal. They pressed his face into the dirt. They drove their knees into his back. Someone hit him on the head with something hard, and for a moment, the world went gray. When his vision cleared, Colonel Whitmore was standing over him. The colonel was smoking a cigar, looking down at Daniel the way a man might look at a mildly interesting insect. "Now, Daniel?" Whitmore said, his voice calm and reasonable. "You are far too valuable to lose. I have invested a great deal in your training. Your skills bring this plantation considerable income, so I'm going to overlook this little outburst. But you need to understand something." He crouched down, bringing his face close to Daniel's. "Your family is not valuable. Your wife is a decent cook, but I have a dozen women who can cook. Your son is strong, but I have hundreds of strong young men. Your daughter is pretty, but pretty girls are easy to find. And your youngest, well, children that age are hardly worth the food they eat." Whitmore stood up and brushed the dust from his white trousers. "I have debts, Daniel. Significant debts. And Mr. Cornelius Finch here has offered me a fair price for your family. It is simply good business." Daniel lifted his head and looked at the man standing beside Whitmore. Cornelius Finch was a slave trader from New Orleans, well known throughout the region. He was a small man with a thin mustache and eyes like a rat. He specialized in what the trade called fancy goods, which was a polite way of describing the sale of women and girls for sexual exploitation. He also dealt in bulk labor for the most dangerous industries: coal mines, sugar plantations, railroad construction, places where life expectancy was measured in months, not years. Finch consulted a small leather notebook. "The woman will bring a good price in New Orleans. Still attractive despite her age. The older boy will go to the coal mines in Virginia. Strong back, should last a few years. The girl." He smiled in a way that made Daniel's blood freeze. "I have a special buyer in Atlanta who pays premium prices for girls her age. And the little one, well, children are always in demand. Daniel heard the words, but they did not seem real. This could not be happening. Not after everything he had done. Not after 16 years of perfect obedience. Not after all the times he had swallowed his pride, buried his anger, accepted humiliation after humiliation, all to keep his family safe. Ruth was still on the ground. She had stopped screaming. She was looking at Daniel now, and in her eyes he saw something that shattered him completely. It was not fear. It was not despair. It was a question he could not answer. "Why are you not saving us?" The men began loading them into the wagon. Ruth first, thrown in like a sack of grain. Then Samuel, still bleeding, still half-conscious. Then Eliza, walking mechanically, her eyes empty. And finally Benjamin, still crying, still reaching out, still calling for his father. Daniel fought against the men holding him. He twisted and pulled and screamed until his voice gave out. But it did not matter. Nothing mattered. The wagon began to move. Ruth managed to sit up. She looked back at Daniel, and in that moment, she spoke the words that would change everything. Find them. No matter how long it takes. Find our children. Then the wagon turned a corner, and they were gone. The overseers released Daniel. He lay in the dirt for a long time, staring at the empty road. The sun beat down on him. The world continued around him. Somewhere a bird was singing. Somewhere a horse whinnied. Life went on as if nothing had happened, as if a man's entire reason for living had not just been ripped away. Finally, one of the overseers kicked him in the ribs. "Get up. Get back to work. That axle isn't going to fix itself." Daniel stood slowly. His body was present. His hands were moving. He walked back to the forge. He picked up his hammer. He struck the metal. Clang, clang, clang. The rhythm continued. The work went on. But inside Daniel Cross, something fundamental had shifted. The man who walked back to that forge was not the same man who had left it an hour earlier. That man, the obedient slave, the perfect worker, the invisible survivor, that man was dead. In his place stood something else, something forged in grief and rage and a terrible, consuming purpose. Daniel Cross was going to find his family, and everyone who had taken them from him was going to pay. In the weeks following the sale, Daniel continued his work at the forge. He spoke when spoken to. He completed every task assigned to him. He gave no indication that anything had changed. The overseers, who had expected grief or rage, or perhaps a foolish escape attempt, were relieved. The valuable blacksmith had accepted his loss. Things could return to normal. They had no idea. Every night, alone in his cabin, Daniel planned. He could not read or write, or at least, that was what everyone believed. The truth was that Ruth had taught him in secret years ago, using a Bible she had stolen from the big house. Teaching a slave to read was illegal in Mississippi, punishable by severe whipping or worse. But Ruth had taken the risk, night after night, tracing letters by candlelight, sounding out words, opening a door that was supposed to remain forever closed. Daniel had learned, and he had never told anyone. Now, that secret knowledge became his greatest weapon. He began to gather information. Slowly, carefully, listening to conversations he was not supposed to hear, watching, waiting. Cornelius Finch had taken his family to New Orleans. That much he knew. But New Orleans was just a distribution point. From there, they would be sold again, scattered to different corners of the South. Daniel needed more specific information. He needed to know exactly where each member of his family had been sent. And he needed to do it without anyone suspecting what he was planning. His opportunity came 3 weeks after the sale. A wagon arrived from a neighboring plantation with a broken wheel hub. The driver was a black man named Thomas, an enslaved coachman who had driven his master's family all over the region. Thomas was known as a man who heard things. Gossip, rumors, news from other plantations. Information flowed through the network of enslaved people, like water through underground channels. Invisible to white eyes, but vital to black survival, Daniel repaired the wheel. As he worked, he asked questions, casual questions, questions that could be explained away as idle curiosity. Had Thomas heard anything about the slaves sold from Thornwood? Did he know where they had been sent? Thomas looked at Daniel for a long moment. He understood what was really being asked, and he understood the risk of answering. But Thomas had lost a brother to the slave trade 10 years earlier. He knew the pain. He knew the desperation, and so he spoke. Ruth had been sold to a place in New Orleans called the Magnolia House. It was a high-end brothel in the French Quarter that catered to wealthy white men. Women sold there rarely lasted long. The combination of abuse, disease, and despair usually killed them within a few years. Samuel had been sold to the Harrison Mining Company in Virginia. Coal mines, backbreaking work in dark tunnels, breathing poisonous air, facing cave-ins and explosions. The average life expectancy for a slave in the coal mines was 3 to 5 years. Eliza had been purchased by a judge in Atlanta named Cornelius Brandt. Thomas did not say more, but the look in his eyes said enough. Everyone knew what men like Judge Brandt wanted with young girls. And Benjamin. Little Benjamin had been sold to a family in Vicksburg, Mississippi, a planter named Marcus Webb, who had bought him as a companion for his 19-year-old son. A living toy, a punching bag, an object for casual cruelty. Daniel memorized every detail, every name, every location. And when Thomas left, Daniel returned to his forge with a new fire burning inside him. He now knew where his family was. 4 different locations, 4 different states, hundreds of miles apart. An impossible task for any man, an impossible task for a slave who could not travel freely, who had no money, no resources, no allies. But Daniel Cross was not any man, and he had one advantage that no one suspected: he knew how to make things. Any things, including the things he would need to wage a one-man war against the institution that had destroyed his family. Over the next 6 months, Daniel worked in secret. During the day, he completed his normal duties. Horseshoes, tools, wagon repairs, everything Colonel Whitmore expected. But at night, by the dim light of his forge, he created other things. A knife, thin and deadly, designed to fit inside the hollow handle of his favorite hammer. He could carry it anywhere without suspicion. A set of lockpicks forged from scrap metal, capable of opening any lock he had ever encountered. He had spent years repairing locks for plantation owners across the county. He knew their weaknesses intimately. Keys, master keys copied from originals that passed through his forge for repair. Keys to sheds, to storage buildings, to the big house itself. A length of chain with deliberately weakened links. It looked identical to regular chain, but it could be broken with a single sharp pull. And something special. Something he worked on only in the darkest hours of the night, when he was certain no one would see. Daniel was preparing for war. But weapons were not enough. He also needed information. He needed to know the routes between plantations, the schedules of patrols, the locations of safe houses along the Underground Railroad, the contacts who could help a fugitive slave disappear. For this, he reached out to the invisible network that existed among the enslaved. A whispered word here, a meaningful glance there. Slowly, carefully, he gathered intelligence. An old woman who worked in the laundry had a cousin in Memphis who knew a conductor on the railroad. A field hand had once escaped and been recaptured, but before they caught him, he had learned the routes through the swamps. A house servant had overheard the master discussing the reward system for capturing fugitives, revealing how the hunters operated. piece by piece. Daniel assembled a map, not on paper, which could be discovered, but in his mind. Routes and contacts and safe houses and danger points, all committed to perfect memory. By September of 1858, he was ready. September 12th was a moonless night. Daniel had chosen it deliberately. Darkness would be his ally. He had also chosen it because he knew that Colonel Whitmore would be away, attending a horse race in Vicksburg. The overseer in charge during the colonel's absence was a man named Patterson, a drunk who was usually unconscious by 9:800. At midnight, Daniel made his move. First, he went to the slave quarters. Not all of them, just the cabins of people he trusted. 23 men and women who had been waiting for this moment. Daniel had recruited them carefully over the past months. Some had families who had been sold away. Others simply could not bear another day in chains. All of them understood the risks. If they were caught, they would be tortured and killed. But they also understood that some things were worth dying for. Using his copied keys, Daniel unlocked the doors of the main storage shed. Inside were supplies they would need: food, blankets, tools. They moved silently, loading what they could carry. Then Daniel walked to the stables. He did not take the horses. That would be too obvious. But he did something else. He opened the door to the hay barn and used his forged tinder to start a small fire in the back corner. It would take about 15 minutes to spread, long enough for him and the others to disappear into the woods, long enough to create chaos and confusion that would delay any pursuit. The fire caught. Orange flames began to lick at the dry hay. Daniel watched for just a moment, then turned and ran. They met at the edge of the forest, 23 shadows in the darkness. Daniel led them north, following paths he had memorized from countless conversations and scraps of information. They moved quickly but carefully, avoiding roads, sticking to streams and gullies where dogs would lose their scent. By dawn they were 12 miles from Thornwood. Behind them, smoke still rose from the burning plantation. Ahead of them lay freedom or death, probably both, for some. At a fork in a creek, Daniel stopped. The others looked at him expectantly. "This is where we separate," he said quietly. "The railroad contacts are 2 miles north. They will take you to the next station, and from there to the border. Do not stop. Do not hesitate. Do not look back." An old woman named Harriet stepped forward. She had been a field hand for 40 years. Her back was bent. Her hands were gnarled, but her eyes were sharp. "You are not coming with us." It was not a question. Daniel shook his head. "I have something I need to do first." And everyone knew what he meant. Everyone had heard about his family. No one tried to stop him. One by one, they embraced him. Then they disappeared into the darkness, heading north toward Canada, toward freedom, toward a new life that Daniel had made possible. Daniel watched them go. Then he turned south. Everyone expected a fugitive slave to run north. That was where freedom lay. That was where the Underground Railroad led. Every patrol, every slave catcher, every bounty hunter would be looking north. No one would expect him to go south, deeper into slave territory, closer to the heart of the system that had destroyed his family. That was exactly why he did it. Daniel Cross was not running away. He was running toward something. Toward Ruth in New Orleans, toward Samuel in Virginia, toward Eliza in Atlanta, toward Benjamin in Vicksburg, toward the men who had taken everything from him, and toward a reckoning that would echo through history. The journey from Mississippi to New Orleans covered approximately 300 miles. For a white man on horseback, it was a trip of perhaps 5 days. For a fugitive slave traveling on foot, moving only at night, avoiding every road and town and farmhouse, it was a journey of nearly 3 weeks. Daniel moved like a ghost through the Louisiana wilderness. He had learned to read the land the way other men read books. The position of the stars told him direction. The behavior of animals warned him of approaching humans. The texture of the soil revealed whether a path was frequently traveled or long abandoned. He ate what he could find: berries, roots, the occasional rabbit caught in a snare he fashioned from vine. He slept during the day, hidden in thickets or hollow logs or abandoned buildings, always with one eye open, always ready to run. The reward posters appeared within a week of his escape. Colonel Whitmore had offered $5,000 for Daniel's capture, the largest bounty in Mississippi history. The posters described him in detail: age 38, height 5'10", muscular build, scarred hands, skilled blacksmith. They warned that he was dangerous and possibly armed. They authorized deadly force if necessary. Daniel saw one of these posters nailed to a tree near Baton Rouge. He stood in the shadows and read his own description, his own price. $5,000. That was more than most white families earned in a decade. Every bounty hunter, every slave catcher, every poor farmer looking for easy money would be searching for him. He smiled grimly and continued south. On October 3, 1858, Daniel Cross reached New Orleans. The city was unlike anything he had ever seen. Even from the outskirts, it overwhelmed the senses. The smell of the river mixed with cooking spices and rotting garbage, and something sweet that might have been flowers or might have been decay. The sounds of music and shouting and clattering carriages filled the air at all hours. And the people. Thousands upon thousands of people, white and black and everything in between, crowded into streets so narrow that the buildings seemed to lean toward each other like gossiping neighbors. New Orleans was the largest slave market in the United States. Every year, tens of thousands of enslaved people passed through its auction houses, bought and sold like livestock. But it was also a city where free black people lived and worked and owned businesses. A city where a black man could walk down the street without attracting immediate suspicion, as long as he looked like he belonged. A city where Daniel could disappear into the crowd while he searched for Ruth. He found work at a blacksmith shop in the Faubourg Marigny neighborhood, owned by a free black man named Jean Baptiste Mercier. Daniel introduced himself as a freedman from Virginia, traveling south to find work. His skills spoke for themselves. Within a day, Mercier had hired him. For 2 weeks, Daniel worked at the shop and gathered information. He asked careful questions about the city's geography, its businesses, its underground economy. He learned that the Magnolia House was located in the French Quarter, on a quiet street near the river. It was one of the most exclusive establishments of its kind, catering to wealthy planters, politicians, and businessmen. The women there were kept under close guard. They were valuable property, not to be damaged or lost. Daniel also learned that the Magnolia House had a back entrance, used for deliveries and for removing women who had become too sick or too broken to be profitable. This entrance was guarded by a single man between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning, when business was slowest. On the night of October 17th, Daniel made his move. He approached the back entrance at 300 in the morning, carrying a bag of tools from the blacksmith shop. He walked with the confident stride of a man who belonged there, a delivery man or a repairman. Nothing unusual. The guard, a heavy, set white man with a pistol on his hip, looked up as Daniel approached. "Delivery," Daniel said, holding up the bag. "Lock needs fixing on the 3rd floor." "Madam sent for me." The guard frowned. "Nobody told me about any delivery." Daniel shrugged. "You want to wake Madame and ask her, 'Be my guest.'" But she was not happy about that lock. Said it's been broken for a week and nobody done nothing about it. The guard hesitated. Waking the madam for something trivial was a good way to lose a job, or worse. After a long moment, he stepped aside. "Make it quick." Daniel nodded and walked through the door. The interior of the Magnolia house was dark and quiet. The clients had gone home. The women were locked in their rooms. Daniel moved silently through the corridors, checking each door, listening for any sound that might tell him where Ruth was being held. He found her on the second floor. The door was locked, but locks had never been a problem for Daniel. He pulled out his picks and went to work. 30 seconds later, the mechanism clicked open. The room was small and bare: a narrow bed, a wash basin, a single window covered with iron bars. And on the bed, curled into a ball, was Ruth. She had aged 10 years and 6 months. Her hair, once thick and black, was streaked with gray. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollow. Her arms were covered with bruises in various stages of healing. She was so thin that Daniel could see the outline of her ribs through her worn cotton shift. But when she opened her eyes and saw him, something sparked back to life. Something that had been dying slowly in that room for months. "Daniel." Her voice was barely a whisper. She thought she was dreaming. She had dreamed of him so many times. Dreamed of rescue. Dreamed of escape. And every time, she woke to find herself still trapped in this nightmare. But Daniel was real. He crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered her into his arms. "I came for you," he said. "Just like you told me to." Ruth began to cry. Silent tears, because even now, even in this moment, she knew better than to make noise. Daniel held her and let her cry, feeling her body shake against his, feeling the bones beneath her skin, feeling the weight of everything she had endured. But there was no time for grief.
"Not yet. Can you walk?"
he asked. Ruth nodded. She would crawl if she had to. She would drag herself through broken glass if it meant getting out of this place. Daniel helped her to her feet. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders. Then he led her back through the corridors, past the sleeping guard, who had not heard a thing, out the back door, and into the New Orleans night. They were 2 blocks away when the Magnolia house exploded into flames. Daniel had left a gift behind a small device he had constructed at the forge, a container of whale oil connected to a slow, burning fuse. By the time anyone noticed the fire, it had already spread to the upper floors. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the building was fully engulfed. 23 men died in the Magnolia house fire. The newspapers called it a tragic accident. A lamp left burning near curtains. Carelessness that cost lives. No one suspected arson. No one connected it to the fugitive slave from Mississippi. But Daniel knew, and Ruth knew, and for the rest of their lives, neither of them spoke of it. Daniel and Ruth spent 2 weeks hiding in the attic of a safe house in New Orleans, a station on the Underground Railroad run by a free black woman named Adelaide. During those 2 weeks, Ruth slowly regained her strength. She ate, she slept, she began to look like herself again. But she also told Daniel what had happened to her. Everything, every detail, every horror. She told him because she needed him to understand. She needed him to know why what they were doing was not justified, but necessary. When she finished, Daniel sat in silence for a long time. Then he spoke. "I am going to find the others. Samuel, Eliza, Benjamin. I am going to bring them back." Ruth looked at him. She did not try to talk him out of it. She knew it would be pointless. Instead, she said something that surprised him. "I am coming with you." Daniel started to protest. The journey would be dangerous. She was still weak. If they were caught together, they would both die. But Ruth stopped him with a look. "They are my children too. I did not carry them for 9 months, nurse them through fevers, watch them take their first steps, just to let someone else rescue them. If we die together, but I am not staying behind." Daniel knew better than to argue. And truth be told, he did not want to. He had spent 6 months alone, carrying his grief and his rage like a physical weight. The thought of facing what lay ahead with Ruth beside him was more than a comfort. It was a lifeline. On November 1st, 1858, Daniel and Ruth left New Orleans and headed north toward Virginia. The journey to the Harrison Mining Company took 2 months. Winter had arrived, and the roads were muddy and treacherous. But the cold also worked in their favor. Fewer patrols. Fewer bounty hunters willing to brave the elements for a chance at reward money. Daniel and Ruth moved steadily northward, staying in safe houses when they could, camping in the wilderness when they could not. They arrived in Richmond, Virginia, in late December. The coal mines were located about 30 miles west of the city, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Daniel found work at a blacksmith shop in the city, just as he had in New Orleans. Ruth found work as a laundress for a wealthy family, a position that allowed her to gather information about the mining operations in the region. The Harrison Mining Company was owned by a man named Harrison Cole. He was 45 years old, a former Army officer who had invested his military pension in coal mining and made a fortune. He owned 300 enslaved workers who labored in his mines 12 to 16 hours a day. The work was brutal beyond description. Men crawled through tunnels barely tall enough to kneel in, hacking at coal seams with pick and shovel, breathing air thick with dust that turned their lungs black. Cave-ins were common. Explosions were frequent. The average life expectancy for a slave in the Harrison mines was 3 years. Samuel had been there for 9 months. Daniel learned from contacts in the local black community that Samuel was still alive, but barely. He had lost 3 fingers in a mining accident. He coughed constantly, a sign that the coal dust was already destroying his lungs. He had been whipped twice for working too slowly. But he was alive, and that was all that mattered. The mines were heavily guarded. Unlike a plantation, where slaves worked in open fields, the mines were contained spaces with limited access points. Armed guards patrolled the entrances. Slaves were locked in barracks at night. Escape was nearly impossible, but Daniel had not come this far to be stopped by guards and locks. On Christmas Eve, 1858, while Harrison Cole and his family celebrated the holiday with a lavish dinner, Daniel put his plan into action. He had spent weeks studying the mine's layout. He knew that the main shaft had 3 ventilation tunnels that connected to the surface. These tunnels were too small for an adult to crawl through, but they were large enough to drop things into. Things like smoke bombs, made from a mixture of sulfur and charcoal, designed to fill the tunnels with choking fumes and force an evacuation. At 900 that night, Daniel lit the smoke bombs and dropped them into 2 of the ventilation shafts. Within minutes, thick gray smoke began pouring out of the mine entrance. Guards shouted in confusion. Bells rang. Slaves came stumbling out of the tunnels, coughing and gasping, desperate for clean air. In the chaos, Daniel slipped into the mine through the 3rd ventilation shaft, which he had left clear. He moved through the darkness with a small lamp, searching for Samuel. The tunnels were a maze, branching and intersecting in patterns that made no sense to anyone who did not know them. But Daniel had bribed a former mine slave for a map, and he followed it faithfully. He found Samuel in a side tunnel near the back of the mine. His son was barely recognizable. 9 months of brutal labor had transformed the strong young man into a skeleton. His ribs showed through his skin. His eyes were sunken. His right hand was wrapped in dirty bandages, covering the stumps where his fingers used to be. He was sitting against the tunnel wall, too weak to move, waiting for someone to tell him what to do. When he saw Daniel, he did not believe it. He thought the smoke had affected his mind. He thought he was dying, and this was a vision sent to comfort him. But then Daniel spoke. "Get up, son. Your mother is waiting." Samuel's eyes went wide, and then, for the first time in 9 months, he smiled. Daniel half carried his son through the tunnels and out through the ventilation shaft. They emerged into the cold night air, surrounded by chaos. Guards were running everywhere, trying to organize the evacuation, trying to account for the slaves, trying to figure out what had happened. No one noticed 2 shadowy figures disappearing into the forest. But Daniel was not finished. 3 hours later, after Samuel and Ruth were safely hidden in a farmhouse 5 miles away, Daniel returned to the mining camp. The chaos had subsided. The slaves were being herded back into their barracks. The guards were returning to their posts. Harrison Cole himself had come down from his house to survey the situation, still dressed in his Christmas dinner finery. Daniel watched from the darkness of the forest. He waited until Cole was alone, standing near the mine entrance, shouting orders at his men. Then Daniel stepped out of the shadows. Cole saw him and frowned. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel did not answer. He walked toward Cole with slow, deliberate steps. Cole reached for the pistol at his hip, but Daniel was faster. He grabbed Cole's wrist, twisted it, and heard the bone snap. The pistol fell to the ground. Cole screamed. Daniel picked up the pistol and pressed it against Cole's forehead. "My son worked in your mine for 9 months. He lost 3 fingers. He will cough blood for the rest of his life. I want you to know why this is happening to you." Cole's eyes were wide with terror. He tried to speak, to beg, to offer money. But Daniel was not interested in words. He dragged Cole to the edge of the deepest mining shaft. It was a vertical drop of over 200 feet, straight down into darkness. "This is for Samuel," Daniel said, and he pushed Harrison Cole into the pit. The scream lasted a long time. Then it stopped. Daniel disappeared into the night. By morning, he was 50 miles away, heading south toward Atlanta with Ruth and Samuel. The journey to Georgia took another month. Samuel was weak, and they had to move slowly. But he grew stronger every day. The fresh air helped his lungs. The food helped his body. And the knowledge that his father had come for him, had walked into hell itself to bring him out, helped his spirit. Ruth told Samuel about the Magnolia house, about what had happened there, about the fire. Samuel listened in silence. When she finished, he looked at his father with new understanding. "How many more?" he asked. "2, Daniel said. "Your sister and your brother. Then we are done." Samuel nodded. He did not ask for details. He did not need to. He understood what his father was doing, and he wanted to help. They reached Atlanta in early February of 1859. The city was smaller than New Orleans, but it was growing rapidly. Fueled by the railroad that connected it to the rest of the South, it was a city of merchants and lawyers and politicians. People who considered themselves civilized. People who would never dirty their hands with the crude business of slavery. They simply profited from it quietly. Judge Cornelius Brandt was one of these people. He was 67 years old, a respected member of the Georgia judiciary. He had served on the bench for over 30 years. He was known for his harsh sentences, particularly for slaves who committed crimes against white property. He was also known, in certain circles, for his particular tastes. Young girls. The younger, the better. He purchased them, used them, and when they became too old for his interests, he sold them or gave them away. It was an open secret among the Atlanta elite, but no one spoke of it. He was a judge, after all. He was above the law. Eliza had been in his house for nearly a year. Daniel spent 3 weeks watching the Brandt residence, a large brick mansion on Peachtree Street. He learned the judge's routine. He learned when the servants came and went. He learned which rooms Eliza was kept in. He learned everything. And then he learned something else. Something that changed his plans. Judge Brandt was dying. The old man had been diagnosed with a cancer of the stomach. He had perhaps 6 months to live. He was already weak, rarely leaving his bed. He had hired additional servants to care for him in his final days. Daniel had planned to kill him quickly. A knife in the dark, a silent end to a monstrous life. But now he reconsidered. Death was too good for Cornelius Brandt. On the night of February 23, 1859, Daniel entered the Brandt mansion through a window on the 2nd floor. The judge's bedroom was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long hallway. Daniel moved silently through the house, avoiding the servants, climbing the stairs, reaching the door at the end of the hall. He picked the lock and stepped inside. The room smelled of sickness. Judge Brandt lay in a massive 4-poster bed, propped up on pillows, his face pale and gaunt. He was awake, reading legal documents by candlelight. When he saw Daniel, he did not scream. He simply looked at him with tired eyes. "Have you come to rob me?" Daniel walked to the side of the bed. He looked down at the man who had taken his daughter, who had done unspeakable things to her for nearly a year, who would have continued until she was broken beyond repair. "No," Daniel said. "I have come to make sure you suffer." What happened over the next 3 hours was never recorded in any official document. The servants heard nothing. The neighbors heard nothing. When they found Judge Brandt the next morning, he was still alive, but he was begging them to kill him. He begged for 47 more days before death finally came. The doctor said it was the cancer and complications. Nothing suspicious, but Daniel knew. And somewhere in whatever hell awaited men like Cornelius Brandt, the judge knew, too. Eliza was found in a locked room on the 2nd floor. She was thin and silent, her eyes empty, her spirit nearly extinguished. But when Daniel carried her out of that house and brought her to where Ruth was waiting, something in her began to heal. Her mother held her and cried and told her it was over. It was finally over. And Eliza believed her. One more. Just one more. Benjamin was in Vicksburg, Mississippi, less than 50 miles from Thornwood. Daniel was going back to where it all began. They traveled west through Alabama and into Mississippi. Daniel sent Ruth, Samuel, and Eliza ahead to Memphis, where contacts on the Underground Railroad would keep them safe. He would meet them there after he retrieved Benjamin. But first, there was something he needed to do. Vicksburg sat on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. It was a strategic location, a wealthy city, a center of commerce and culture. The Webb family lived in a white, columned house on Cherry Street overlooking the river. Marcus Webb was a cotton broker who had made a fortune buying and selling other people's crops. His son, also named Marcus, was 19 years old, a spoiled young man who had never worked a day in his life. Benjamin had been his toy for almost a year. Daniel did not bother with subtlety this time. He did not watch. He did not plan. He walked up to the front door of the Webb house in the middle of the afternoon and kicked it open. The elder Marcus Webb was in the parlor, reading a newspaper. He looked up in shock as Daniel entered. "What is the meaning of?" Daniel hit him once, a single blow to the temple, and Webb collapsed unconscious. The younger Marcus came running down the stairs, a riding crop in his hand, ready to discipline whatever slave had caused this disturbance. He stopped when he saw Daniel. "Who are you?" "I am Benjamin's father." The color drained from young Marcus's face. He knew. He knew what he had done. He knew what he deserved. He tried to run. Daniel caught him at the foot of the stairs. The riding crop clattered to the floor. Daniel dragged him into the parlor and threw him against the wall. Mrs. Webb appeared at the top of the stairs, screaming, Daniel ignored her. "Where is my son?" Young Marcus was crying now, tears and snot running down his face. He pointed toward the back of the house. "The shed. He's in the shed." "Please, I didn't mean." Daniel hit him again, harder this time. Young Marcus went down and did not get up. Daniel walked through the house and out the back door. The shed was a small wooden structure near the edge of the property. It had no windows. The door was padlocked. Daniel broke the lock with a single blow from a rock. Inside, curled up on a pile of dirty straw, was Benjamin. He was 8 years old now, but he looked younger. He was tiny, malnourished, covered in bruises and welts. He flinched when Daniel entered, raising his hands to protect his face. "Please," he whispered. "I'll be good. I'll be good." Daniel felt something break inside him, something he had held together through months of travel and violence and vengeance. He fell to his knees beside his son and pulled him into his arms. "It's me, Benjamin. It's your father. I came to take you home." Benjamin did not believe it at first. He had stopped believing in hope long ago. But Daniel held him and whispered to him and rocked him gently, the way he used to when Benjamin was a baby, when the world was safe and simple and full of promise. Slowly, Benjamin began to cry, and then to hold on, and then to believe. Daniel carried his son out of that shed and walked toward the house. The elder Webb was still unconscious on the parlor floor. The younger Webb was groaning, trying to crawl toward the door. Mrs. Webb had fled, probably to summon help. Daniel looked at the two men on the floor. He thought about what they had done to Benjamin. The beatings, the humiliation, the casual cruelty that treated a child like a toy to be used and discarded. He had killed for less. But Benjamin was watching. Benjamin was in his arms, holding on with desperate strength, his eyes wide and frightened. And Daniel realized that some things were more important than vengeance. He walked out of the house without looking back. But before he left Vicksburg, he stopped at the local newspaper office. He left an anonymous note describing in detail what the Webb family had done to an enslaved child. Within a week, the story had spread across Mississippi. The Webbs were ruined. Their business collapsed. Their friends abandoned them. They eventually fled to California, where no one knew their names. It was not death. But for people like the Webbs, it was worse. There was one name left on Daniel's list: Colonel Edmund Whitmore. The man who had started everything. The man who had sold his family. The man who had told Daniel, while 5 men held him down in the dirt, that his wife and children were not valuable. Daniel sent Benjamin ahead to Memphis with a trusted conductor on the railroad. Then he turned south, toward Natchez, toward Thornwood, toward the end of his journey. When he arrived at the plantation, he barely recognized it. The fire he had set during his escape had destroyed the stables and spread to several other buildings. But that was only the beginning. In the month since Daniel's flight, Thornwood had fallen apart. The mass escape of 23 slaves had triggered a panic among the remaining enslaved population. Dozens more had fled in the chaos. The cotton had not been harvested properly. Creditors had seized much of the land. The great White House still stood, but it was a shadow of its former glory. Paint peeling, windows broken, gardens overgrown. Colonel Whitmore was alone. His wife had left him. His children had distanced themselves. His friends had abandoned him. The gambling debts that had caused him to sell Daniel's family had multiplied. The reward money he had posted for Daniel's capture had never been claimed. He was ruined. Daniel found him in the library, surrounded by empty bottles, staring at nothing. The once proud plantation owner was now a broken old man, waiting to die. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long moment. Whitmore did not notice him at first. When he finally looked up, His eyes took several seconds to focus. "Daniel." His voice was cracked and weak. "You came back." Daniel stepped into the room. In his hand, he carried the object he had been forging for months before his escape. The object he had planned to use from the very beginning. It was a chain, not just any chain, a masterpiece of the blacksmith's art. Each link was perfectly formed, polished to a shine, etched with intricate patterns, and along its length, carved into the metal with painstaking precision, were names. 147 names. Every slave that Edmund Whitmore had sold during his lifetime. Every family he had destroyed. Every life he had shattered. Daniel had spent years gathering those names, memorizing them, honoring them. And now they were immortalized in iron. Daniel placed the chain on the table in front of Whitmore. "Do you know what this is?" Whitmore looked at the chain. He squinted at the names. His face went pale. "These are the people you sold," Daniel said. "Every one of them had a mother, a father, children, dreams. You took all of that away. You treated them like animals, worse than animals. And you never lost a moment's sleep over it." Whitmore opened his mouth to speak, but Daniel was not finished. "You told me my family was not valuable. Do you remember that? You said my wife was just a cook, my son was just a strong back, my daughter was just a pretty face, my baby was not worth the food he ate." Daniel leaned close. "I found them all, every one. I brought them back, and everyone who took them from me is dead, or wishes they were." Whitmore began to tremble. He understood now. He understood what Daniel had done, what Daniel was capable of doing. "Please," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." Daniel looked at him. This man who had owned him, who had controlled every aspect of his life for 38 years, who had the power of life and death over hundreds of human beings, and had wielded that power with casual cruelty. "You knew," Daniel said. "You just didn't care." What happened in that library over the next several hours was never officially recorded. The servants had all fled. The neighbors had long since stopped visiting. There was no one to witness what Daniel Cross did to Colonel Edmund Whitmore. But there are stories, whispered tales passed down through generations in the black communities of Mississippi. They say that Whitmore was found 3 days later, still alive. The chain wrapped around his body so tightly that it had cut into his flesh. They say he begged for death for weeks, before it finally came. They say his screams could be heard for miles. Daniel Cross left Thornwood for the last time as the sun rose over the cotton fields. He did not look back. There was nothing left to see. 6 weeks later, Daniel crossed into Canada with his family. They settled in a small town called Buckton, about 50 miles east of Detroit. It was a community founded by former slaves, a place where black people could own land, start businesses, raise families in peace. Daniel never touched a forge again. He had spent enough of his life working with fire and metal. Instead, he became a teacher. He taught other escaped slaves to read and write, giving them the tools to build new lives in a new country. Ruth opened a boarding house that secretly served as a station on the Underground Railroad. For years, she sheltered fugitives on their way to freedom, feeding them, clothing them, helping them disappear into the vast Canadian wilderness. Samuel studied medicine. Despite the damage to his lungs from the coal mines, he became a doctor. One of the first black physicians in the province of Ontario, he spent his career treating patients who had no one else to turn to, former slaves and free blacks and poor whites who could not afford white doctors. Eliza never fully recovered from what had been done to her. She never married. She rarely spoke of her time in Atlanta, but she found purpose in caring for children. She founded an orphanage for black children, many of them the sons and daughters of slaves who had not made it to freedom. She raised them with fierce love, determined that they would never know the horrors she had experienced. And Benjamin, little Benjamin, who had been bought as a toy for a rich man's son, he became a lawyer. After the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, he returned to the United States. He spent the next 40 years tracking down former slave owners and bringing them to justice. He won case after case, securing compensation for former slaves, exposing the crimes of the old plantation system, making sure that the world never forgot what had been done. Daniel Cross died on March 14, 1891, exactly 3 years after his family had been sold away from him. He was surrounded by his wife, his children, his 11 grandchildren, and the countless lives he had touched in his years as a teacher and a conductor on the railroad. His last words were to Ruth, "I found them all, just like I promised." Ruth held his hand and smiled through her tears. "I know you did. I always knew you would." Daniel Cross was buried in the Buckton Cemetery, beside the graves of other former slaves who had made the journey to freedom. His tombstone bears no mention of the things he did in 1858 and 1859. No mention of the Magnolia House or the Harrison Mines or Judge Brandt or the Webb family. No mention of Conal Whitmore or the chain with 147 names. It simply reads the Daniel Cross in 1820 to 1891 husband, father, teacher. He kept his promise. That says that the story of Daniel Cross was never written in the official history books. The newspapers of the time recorded the events as accidents, coincidences, unrelated tragedies. A fire in a New Orleans brothel, a mining accident in Virginia, a judge dying of natural causes, a family ruined by scandal, a plantation owner found dead in his library. But the truth survived in other ways. In the whispered stories passed from parent to child in black communities across the South. In the songs that spoke of a man who walked into hell and brought his family back. In the legends of the blacksmith who forged his own justice when the law refused to provide it. And now you know the truth, too. Daniel Cross was not a saint. He killed men. He burned buildings. He did things that no law could condone. But he did them for the only reason that ever mattered. He did them for love. The system that enslaved him was vast and powerful and protected by all the authority of law and custom and tradition. It told him that his family was property, that his love was worthless, that his children could be sold like animals, and he had no right to object. Daniel Cross disagreed, and he was willing to burn the world down to prove it. Some people called him a monster. Some people called him a hero. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But one thing is certain. When they took everything from Daniel Cross, they made a mistake. They created something far more dangerous than a slave. They created a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. And in the end, that man won. This was the story of Daniel Cross. A story that haunts history. A story that will never be forgotten.